Everyone who raises children abroad will wonder at some point how to help them grow up as self confident and resilient children. I grew up abroad myself and I'm raising my children in other countries too. And I learned that there is not one solution that fits all, but there is a kind of mentality that surely helps parents and children make the best and healthiest out of the many cultures, languages, ways of doing, saying, and understanding things. And this is by embracing a not only but also mentality. What I'm going to share with you in this video is what I presented at a parenting conference and what I also tell parents in my webinars and workshops. What is this mentality I'm talking about? Well, it requires that we and our children develop an understanding for diversity, ideally in the most natural and spontaneous way, ideally also starting from home. How can we do this? Now, the best way to tackle a problem is to understand where it comes from, how it is structured, and somehow find a way to make sense of it. We all categorize people and situations in a split second. Let me use shapes to illustrate this. Is it a round situation or person, or a square one, a triangle one, or does it look or feel like a star or a sun, a hexagon maybe? And what about the color or the texture? These shapes might remind you about the box our little ones play with. From early on, in fact, our infants learn that pieces only fit in a box when the shape is the same as the hole in the box. They proceed by trial and error and turn the piece as long as it fits, and they learn that certain shapes just fit certain parts of the box. Fast forward a few years, we are very good at this. And because this is not only a fine motor skill, but a cognitive skill we need to actually survive. We all base our opinion and our decisions about a situation or a person on how we perceive it, how they look like, the first impression we have of them, and on our experience. We organize information, concepts, and skills into categories and form the cognitive basis for higher level abilities like applying, analyzing, evaluating those concepts and skills. Categories are the base of language and organization of the world. Categorizing is essential for us as our brain, for example, also organizes the information we're bombarded and immersed with on a daily basis. Our little ones categorize from very early on, like I just said. In fact, babies can distinguish two different languages or even more by the sound of them. They can differentiate the intonation, the pace, the accentuation of words. And as we can't possibly process every single piece of information, our brain creates shortcuts to help us organize, categorize what we are perceiving, and react and act quickly. Categorization is this process of grouping things together based on shared characteristics and attributes. So, for example, we separate oranges from bananas and apples based on size, shape, color, taste, and other factors. Categorization, in fact, is a natural and useful cognitive process that helps us to simplify complex information and make sense of the world around us. Now, our brains take pieces of information associated with familiar objects, sorted according to the schemas, and respond according to how we have been trained to react to the category. Biases, on the other hand, are systematic and often unconscious patterns of thinking that we can lead to unfair and inaccurate judgments about individuals, groups, and situations. They can arise from a variety of factors. For example, personal experience, cultural norms, like how we consider people, habits, and values, or the media, how media portrays people, places, or situations. Social conditioning, how those around us react and act, and emotions. And they can manifest in different ways in stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination, microaggressions. Categorization is not inherently biased, but it can be influenced by biases. And our biases impact our behavior. So now some of the biases are explicit and others are implicit. Explicit biases are biases we are aware of and it's a demonstration of conscious preference or also the aversion towards a person or group. We openly express them and share them with others because they are part of our worldview. Expressions of explicit bias can seem innocuous, but can be discriminatory, harassing, expressing hate and aversion, and lead to excluding people, for example. Any aspect of an individual's identity can become the target of explicit bias, including age, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, ability. And implicit biases involve all of the subconscious feelings like perceptions, attitudes, and stereotypes that have developed as a result of prior influence and imprints. Implicit bias are usually unknown to us. We are not conscious about them. They are our so-called blind spots. It's very difficult to identify them, but they affect our judgment and behaviors. Like when walking on a street at night and we see a person wearing dark clothes and a hoodie coming our way, we immediately sense danger and try to cross the street. And biases like this can lead to discriminatory behavior in a wide range of contexts. In my practice, I help internationals, multilingual and multicultural families maintain their home and heritage languages and cultures whilst embracing new languages and cultures, usually the local ones. Like I mentioned before, I have lived abroad my whole life, and my children are growing up the same way like millions of other children. And we all experience situations where we feel, or other people make us feel, insiders or outsiders for many reasons, mainly due to biases. Now, of course, this can happen to anyone, no matter where we live. But when we look and sound different over and over again, for example, because we move more often, this constant change can affect us and our children. We are much more aware of what makes us different from people around us, and we recognize diversity. In the book Third Culture Kids Growing Up Among Worlds, Ruth van Reken and David Pollock illustrate how multiculturals or internationals in general relate to the surrounding culture and are perceived by it. I've translated or expanded their model to a language identity model where that applies to culture can also be used for our languages. Let me explain the four categories they pointed out. Foreigners, those who look different on the outside by their skin tone, the way they dress or move, and the way they greet each other, and who don't think like locals or don't speak the language yet. They are identified by locals as standing out, looking different, and some of them decide to stay foreigners as long as they live in a place. These internationals then live in a so-called bubble, for example, using mainly English or another dominant language that is used in the community. They might learn the local language, but only on a very superficial level. They barely integrate into the local society. Some don't want to, others can't for one reason or the other. For example, because they are staying only for a short time. Then we have the hidden immigrants. They look like locals, although they don't really share the same values and beliefs. Same goes also for the language they use. They might use the local language, but don't sound like locals yet. They might have a foreign accent or use the language in a different way. They might not understand cultural references yet, don't laugh at the same jokes like locals, or don't use the same metaphors like locals. They are hidden because from the outside they could easily be taken for locals, but they're not. Then we have the adopted ones. They think like locals but don't look like locals. So multilinguals might look different on the outside but use the local language at a high level of proficiency, understand jokes, use cultural references, etc. And locals would approach us by speaking slowly or switching to a more dominant language. And then be surprised actually when we actually can reply fluently in the local language. The adopted, no matter how much they try to blend in, they will stand out by their appearance, at least in settings where people are not used to look beyond the external features of a person. They might blend in by wearing the same clothes, moving like locals, adopting local habits. Here in the Netherlands, for example, using bikes to go everywhere. Now, the mirror ones correspond to those who assimilated to the host culture and language to such an extent that they blend in. You don't recognize them. They look similar to locals, act and talk like them. Now, immigrants, refugees who become mirrors might abandon their heritage language, their home or family language, for political or social reasons, for example. With regards to our heritage language, it's important to know that starting from the second generation of immigrants, chances are very high or increase that the home or heritage languages will fade away or even be abandoned or lost. This is why I'm so adamantly supporting international families and help them, if they want to maintain their heritage languages and pass them on to their children or grandchildren with pride and confidence. Now, I'm myself first generation living abroad my whole life, and my children are second generation, so you may understand my why. Now, these are categories based on assumptions that we are confronted with. Fact is that our children and we usually can switch between those groups or belong to more than one of them. Depending on the language we use or the situation, we can be the mirror, the hidden immigrant, the adopted, or the foreigner. I know that here in the Netherlands and when I lived in Switzerland, I seem like a mirror, but I sometimes feel like a hidden immigrant too, depending on the situation and context. In Italy, it was more an adopted one. Although I grew up there and speak the language fluently, my features didn't really tick the box of a local. And in many places, I surely will look like a foreigner, like in Korea, Japan, and China, in many African countries, and because this is just a fact. But the same way I can be hidden immigrant in any group just because I think and use the language differently than others. In the group, like the parents group or school, I can of be part of any of the other groups as well. I invite you now to think about different everyday situations. When do you feel more like a hidden immigrant or a mirror or a foreigner or an adoptee? Multiculturals and multilinguals thrive in what is called the interstitial culture, I this time translated Ruth von Reken and David Pollock's third culture model into a third language model, with a focus on languages again, or third language then in this case, which is not meant in a chronological hierarchical way. It is meant as the interstitial part, the one where our worlds we live in overlap, and that is where we can use all our languages where they are valued and accepted. This can be, for example, in schools, at home, at work, in a group. Now, in an ideal world, all our languages and cultures would be seen and valued, but we know that this is not the case. The pervasive monolingual bias or the monocultural bias present within many societies threatens the well-being of multilingual and multicultural children and their families. I here slightly changed a quote from Professor Annick de Houwer and add culture to the picture. Now, I invite you to watch the interview we did at Raising Multilinguals Live with Professor Annick de Houwer called Why It's a Bad Idea to Constantly Compare Bilinguals to Monolinguals. Now, the power of disparity among languages like immigrant languages versus those that are taught or used more commonly in a given society or that have higher prestige or are considered more useful is real, at least in the broader society. But in our micro society, let's just say our family, we can give our children the support to develop at their pace all the skills they need and foster their multiple facets so that they can respond and confidently cope with biases that come from the society around them. Many parents ask me what will happen to their children's identity when they grow up, immersed into multiple worlds and switching back and forth between them every day and using different languages. Like Norton emphasizes in her studies, identity is dynamic and constantly changing. It's complex, contradictory, and multifaceted, and something that constructs and is constructed by language. Needless to say that there are inherent power relationships within the interactions and negotiations that shape identity. So some parents might express the need or even the wish that their children use their languages more frequently for one reason or the other, or like some habits and values from their culture. This negotiation is a delicate aspect of language and culture planning in multilingual and multicultural families. When considering multilingual identity and the multiple negotiations involved within and across languages and cultures in our families, the most important aspect for a healthy language and cultural environment at home is that all languages and dialects are equally welcome and supported, that there is no hierarchy. I invite you to watch these interview we did with Ulrike Jesner and Larissa Aronin, where they describe that the dominant languages in our family and our life can change over time. And also the interview where Nair Correa Ibrahim explains her tripartite framework of identity formed by person, place, and experience. At least in our micro society, our family, we should create a place where everyone embraces each other's languages and cultures. This is why I support families set very realistic goals when it comes to their languages and cultures and help them make sure to avoid any bias related to them and move away from a binary perspective of us versus them and foster our agency and our children's agency to attitudes that are crucial in forming self-confidence, a sense of belonging, as well as resilience. If at home, in our family, all languages are valid, have equal rights to be used and fostered, we create an environment of inclusion. And our children will be confident in using their languages and cultures and embracing the multiple facets of who they are and how they express themselves. When our children know that at least at home they are safe no matter what, they can develop the necessary resilience to face the world. And they develop the pride of being who they are. This is what I encourage parents to. I invite them to visualize how their languages and cultures are present at home. When we live abroad, our languages and cultures are less present in the society, and we may want to make sure that our children are seen and valued as where they spend most of their time at school. I refer here to an organization that is called the Language Friendly School that supports schools that allow other languages to be used on the school premises and who implement effective practices in class and where children and their families feel welcome with all their cultural and linguistic facets. If we are not allowed, encouraged, and supported to be who we are, what language we use and like, we are subjected to the opinion and influence of others. So I always invite parents to see their children as individuals, as who they are, with their preferences, tastes, pace, and developing skills, and their language preferences as well. Now, our children who grow up abroad might feel more at home in another language and culture than we do or did. That is not their problem. It's a problem of who is expecting them to be different from what they are. Again, if we embrace our culture and languages at home, if they coexist like a team, reinforce and support each other, if we actively work on fostering them all, we create a context where diversity coexists in an inclusive way. We sometimes feel or are required by others to choose one or of our cultures or languages. Others might doubt, question, or refuse our belonging. They tell us that we are neither nor. You are not German, you don't understand the joke, you sound funny, you are not really a hockey player or whatever. This subtractive way of thinking not only hurts us, it reduces us to a facet of who and what we are. Instead, I invite you to change the language or the narrative and think in an additive way. In fact, that we are not only, but also. Try to do this for your languages, for all your skills, anything. And invite also your children to list up the many languages they use, the many skills they have, for example, in a portrait. Where do you feel your language, your culture, your skill? What parts of your body are important to draw, play the instrument, the sport, anything? The same way Professor François Grosjean pointed out more than 40 years ago already that a bilingual is not two monolinguals in one, but a great mix of them, and compared bilinguals with hurdlers. And here I quote, hurdlers blend two types of competencies, that of high jumping and that of sprinting, into an integrated whole. When compared individually with sprinters or high jumpers, hurdlers meet neither level of competence. And yet, when taken as a whole, Hurdlers are athletes in their own right. No expert in track and field would ever compare hurdlers to sprinters or high jumpers, even though the former blend certain characteristics of the latter too. End of the quote. And I continue this metaphor for multilinguals, that's to say those who use more than 2 languages on a regular basis, daily basis, with decathlon athletes. Now, fact is that we and our children are multi-competent multilinguals, using here a term coined by Li Wei and Vivian Cook, and we can add we are also multi-competent multiculturals. So when others ask us to choose one or only one of our multiple facets, we can respond, what makes you think I'm only one? I can do, you list up the skills, and the same way I am, and you list up others. For example, okay, I'm German, I speak Dutch, English, Italian, French, add whatever language or culture or skill you want. As maintaining our languages abroad is one of the most difficult aspects when raising multicultural and multilingual children. Annelisa Miranda, who is an EAL teacher in an international school in Ghent, Belgium, and I wrote the toolbox for multilingual families with activities and games to foster our home languages in our 0 to 15 plus year olds, focusing on understanding, speaking, reading, and writing. And all this in an enjoyable way. On our YouTube channel Activities for Multilingual Families, we also share videos about activities and games for children of all ages. Now it is your turn to ask questions. Share your experience and your thoughts about being not only but also in the comments of this video.